Next, under pleural diseases, we have pneumothorax. Pneumothorax refers to the presence of air and other gases in the pleural sac. This is one of the conditions that needs immediate treatment. Commonly known as a collapsed lung, this condition occurs when air leaks into the space between a person's chest and lung, causing a sudden chest pain and shortness of breath. Regarded as either simple or spontaneous, pneumothorax is also divided into primary and secondary. The one that occurs without an apparent cause is considered to be the primary pneumothorax. Secondary pneumothorax, on the other hand, occurs in the presence of lung pathology and as consequence from ruptured pulmonary lesions close to the pleural space. We have here a figure that shows the difference between a collapsed lung and a healthy lung. The spontaneous occurrence of a communication between the alveolar spaces and the pleura is the key issue in identifying the exact pathogenesis of pneumothorax. Acute increases in the alveolar pressure that exceed in the pulmonary interstitial pressure can lead to the alveolar rupture and pleural air leakage. So ano nga ba yung communication between the alveolar spaces and the pleura? So the communication of air between the alveolar spaces and the pleura is due to the rupture of subpleural blebs or bullae. Throughout the years, findings regarding the pathogenesis may suggest that there is a spontaneous rupture of subpleural bleb. So itong mga to ay points of weakness in the visceral pleura, wherein other connective tissue abnormalities can predispose the alveoli to rupture in both types of spontaneous pneumothorax, though the exact mechanism of how is not entirely understood. So what are subpleural blebs? So a bleb is an air-filled blister that appears on the lung na kapag nag-rupture, it will cause the lungs to collapse. The main principle of the pathophysiology of spontaneous pneumothorax revolves around gas leaking into the pleural space. For its pathological findings, a case study presented by Capleton et al. 2021 elucidated an understanding on a clinical radiological and histopathological features of a COVID-19 patient which was complicated by pneumothorax. So the histopathological findings revealed that the case of a patient with COVID-19 infection complicated by pneumothorax was described as a patchy parenchymal collapse and congestion, septal fibrosis and edema, intraalveolar fibromyxoid and fibrinous material, and features of pneumatocyl formation. Next, we have pleural effusion. Aligned with the excessive accumulation of fluid in the pleural space, pleural effusion is a condition in which there is an imbalance between the formation of pleural fluid and its removal. The pleura, which is affected, is described as thin layers of tissue lines on the surface of a person's chest wall and covers the outside of the lungs and the inside of the chest cavity. When pleural effusion is acquired, fluid builds up in the space between the layers of the pleura, which aggravates difficulty in breathing. After physical examination, physical findings are signs of volume gain, reduced tactile vocal fremitus, dullness on percussion, shifting dullness, and diminished or absent breath sounds. Pleural effusions accompany a wide variety of disorders of the lung, pleura, and systemic disorders. So this can actually pose a diagnostic dilemma to the treating physician, given that there is a variety of underlying conditions that can cause pleural effusion, such as history of pneumonia, leak from other organs, autoimmune conditions, and infections. The most common causes of pleural effusion are congestive heart failure, cancer, pneumonia, and pulmonary embolism. For instance, in this figure, a patient presented with fever and chest pain since the last 7 days revealed a loculation of fluid that may occur within the fissures or between the pleural layers. For the pathogenesis, the identification of even small effusions is important because this commonly occur and may have clinical significance. So according to Vorster 2015, pleural effusion is likely a manifestation of paucibacillary myobacterial infection within the pleural space. Acquired from the parenchymal lesions, this results in an immunological response, given that it decreases pleural fluid removal and increases pleural fluid formation. A while ago, I have mentioned the part where the fluid builds up in the space between the layers of the pleura and it aggravates difficulty in breathing. So, to understand its pathophysiology in a simpler form, this starts when risk factors associated with pleural effusions, for instance, is smoking, So when the invasion of the bacteria happens, there is a result of an inflammatory process. This then increases the simulation of goblet cells and mucus production. This is where crackles on posterior chest and productive cough appears. This then results in impairment in the gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide, causing diminished breath sounds and difficulty in breathing. In a case study conducted by Seibert et al. 1991, a patient is diagnosed with tuberculous pleural effusion wherein M. tuberculosis was cultured from pleura, sputum, and pleural fluid. The patient has a history of röntgenographic pleural effusion as well. So the histopathological findings revealed that some cases were accompanied by röntgenographic pulmonary parenchymal infiltrates and some were absent.
Moving on to another type of primary disorder classified under the category of pleural tumors is malignant mesothelioma. Before we delve deeper into the process on how this disorder develops and then examine its cell and tissue structure, first let's talk about what malignant mesothelioma is and how it greatly affected the life of factory workers from the previous decades. Malignant mesothelioma is assumed to have a great importance in different pleural diseases due to its highly related exposure to airborne asbestos. First, ano nga ba yung asbestos? Yung asbestos, isa siyang uri ng mineral fiber na nakukuha sa mga bato o lupa na pangkaraniwan nakikita sa pagmimina, paggawaan ng barko, sa mga construction or building materials, pati na rin sa mga pabrika na gumagamit ng materyales na gawa sa asbestos. Asbestos fibers usually get into the air when asbestos materials are disturbed, damaged, or removed unsafely. Kaya kapag nagkapira-piraso yung asbestos, hindi lang siya yung alikabok lang. Kumbaga may kasama siyang tiny fibers na hindi natin nakikita na kapag nalanghap ng mga tao, maaari siyang mag-build up sa lungs at pagmulan ng health problems. Now going back to our topic, malignant mesothelioma is a rare type of cancer in mesothelial cells that usually arise in the parietal or visceral pleura of the lungs, and it less commonly occurs in the peritoneum found in the abdomen and pericardium of the heart. Almost 80 to 90% of individuals that have this cancer have a history of exposure to asbestos, and these individuals that usually work directly with asbestos, like miners, shipyard workers, insulators, and factory workers, are at greater risk. But malignant mesotheliomas also have appeared in people who were living in the vicinity of an asbestos factory or being a relative to an asbestos worker. After the initial exposure of an individual to asbestos, the latent period for the development of malignant mesothelioma is prolonged from 25 to 40 years, suggesting that the process where the changes in the DNA sequence of genes that cause cells to become cancer cells slowly grow and spread in the body, taking about long periods of time. The combination of cigarette smoking and asbestos exposure does not increase the risk for the development of malignant mesothelioma. However, it greatly increases the risk in developing lung carcinoma. When the asbestos dust was inhaled by a person, its fibers remain in the body for life. Same with the lifetime risk after the exposure, hindi rin naman siya nababawasan. Unlike with smoking, kapag tumigil ka na manigarilyo, dun lang nababawasan yung risk. It was hypothesized that these asbestos fibers accumulate near the mesothelial cell layer and produce highly reactive chemicals formed from the oxygen that causes damage to the DNA and causes mutations. Upon sequencing the mesothelioma genomes, it shows that there are multiple driver mutations na nagfo-form into small groups sa pathways na nakikita sa DNA repair, cell cycle control, and growth factor signaling. One of the most mutated genes in malignant mesothelioma is BAP1. This encodes the tumor suppressor gene involved in DNA repair. Yung tumor suppressor genes, sila yung normal genes na nagpapabagal ng cell division, nagre-repair ng DNA, and nagsasabi kung kailan mamamatay yung cells or what we call apoptosis. It is also affected by the germline mutations in families that reveal a high incidence of mesothelioma. Now, let's talk about how malignant mesothelioma develops in an individual's body. The mechanisms on how asbestos leads to cancer are still unknown and debatable until the present time. When an individual inhaled asbestos, it can move into the pleura, where it may be phagocytosed later, or it usually depends on the physical characteristics of the foreign material causing the immune response. Asbestos can induce mesothelial cell proliferation, which contributes to the progression and promotion of tumor over time. Upon asbestos ingestion, macrophages produce lymphokines that slow down the immune function, and thus asbestos is considered an immunosuppressant. The immune response to asbestos increases the secretion of monocyte chemoattractant protein 1 or MCP1, a chemokine that attracts monocytes which eventually differentiate into macrophages. Yung mga macrophages na na-expose sa asbestos, nagpo-produce din sila ng reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species which are called mutagens. There are two most studied forms of asbestos, and these are the chrysotile and crocidolite, and these contain magnesium and ion elements. Hence, they can produce these radical molecules, the ROS and RNS, by catalyzing the redox reactions on the outer surfaces. Chrysotile and crocidolite asbestos increase the level of nitric oxide and peroxynitrite ion, where it can lead to abnormal high quantities of nitric oxide, causing damage to the DNA and changes the DNA bases from guanine to thymidine. At the molecular level, asbestos stimulates phosphorylation of the protein that prompts cell growth and differentiation by binding to the receptor. Now, let's talk about the histopathological classification of malignant mesothelioma. Malignant mesotheliomas are often preceded by extensive pleural fibrosis and having a plaque formation. These tumors begin in a localized area and over time spread widely either by contagious growth or diffuse seeding of pleural surfaces. In the gross morphological structure of malignant mesothelioma, exhibited in the figure on the following slide, is an autopsy of an affected lung that is enclosed by a layer of yellowish-white, firm alternating gelatinous tumor that destroys the pleural space. Neoplasm may immediately occupy the thoracic wall or subpleural lung tissue. However, distant metastasis of this disease is not common. Here we have the gross morphological structure of malignant mesothelioma exhibited in the figure found in the right side of the slide. It is an autopsy of an affected lung that is enclosed by a layer of yellowish-white color. As you can see from the figure, there is a firm alternating gelatinous tumor that destroys the pleural space. The normal appearance of mesothelial cells is usually biphasic, having both sarcomatous and epithelial areas to the pleural lining cells and also the underlying fibrous tissue. There are three morphological appearances of mesotheliomas. The first one is the epithelial cell, also a common pattern and most likely confused with pulmonary adenocarcinoma, in which cuboidal cells with small papillary buds line the tubular and microcystic spaces. The second one is the sarcomatous. It is spindle-shaped, occasionally appears fibroblastic cells that grow in sheaths. And third one is the biphasic, having both the two cell types. As you can see from the figure, here are the different morphological appearances of mesotheliomas.